Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of my shamanic intensives is about belonging, and I'm looking at belonging on the planet and belonging in your body, but also really belonging with other humans. And for a lot of us who are psychic and energetically sensitive and can kind of peek through the veil at our past lives and have a sense of the cosmos and things beyond the everyday and who we are at the level of what we do for work or, our roles in society, sometimes that feeling a sense of belonging with other people can be a little bit hard to come by. And it's unfortunate when we get isolated and disconnected, and I think it's really useful to know that they're finding that loneliness in older adults is up there with smoking a pack a day for risk of early mortality. And what I find interesting about this is there's an importance for connection for human-animal, which can be met and served just by having presence when you interact with a cashier at the grocery store or other humans. Human-animal can get settled and that will absolutely meet needs. And then there's the deeper relating and the more meaningful connection. And so I added a bonus to my most recent belonging program that before I tried to help people belong with their incarnate soul tribe and light them up to magnetize in the people that would really be a good match. Because even if you really march the beat of your own drum, even if you are not standard in a lot of ways, you run your energy differently, what you're looking for in connection, what works for you is really different. The one thing we have on the planet right now is an abundance of people. So it's a sorting problem. And sometimes it involves, using the internet or the phone. There are people I'm very connected to who aren't local. But there's such an opportunity for richness in our social circle. However, we just don't necessarily get taught the skills or the ability, and the healing that I added as the bonus, which I thought was really important and I wanted to talk more about, was about healing the disappointments and the betrayals and the relationship trauma. And for a lot of us, there's sort of okay, here's how I get over a romantic disappointment. But sometimes a friendship ending, especially if it happens badly, or disappointment or loss, ends up cutting deeper than a relationship ending when we're talking about the romantic side of things. And what I was doing specifically with this healing on behalf of the people who signed up for the intensive, and something that you can work with or be aware of in your own practices, was seeing where they had taken themselves out of the game. So this could look like heartbreak that they didn't have the skills or the tools or the ability to heal that turned into heart armor. They're like, I don't trust people. I hear people say, I don't trust people. For me, trust is an inside job. First of all, I want to be really specific about what I'm trusting them for. I need to have enough history to actually gather the data. So I differentiate between affinity or delight or being in someone's fan club and having them be a friend or somebody I'm actively investing energy in sustaining a relationship, because for me those are different things, and there's a certain amount of time, and then I'm trusting my own discernment and my own skill in relating, and I'm also trusting in my resilience, because whether it's a romantic relationship or a friendship or a business arrangement, a coworker, somebody I'm hiring to do something, there are all these instances of relating, and I'm very much about win-win or no deal. So I really treasure having an amazing tax preparer who I deeply trust, a mechanic that I'm like, he's got this. I don't understand the inner workings of my car, but I hand it to him and do what he says. And I just deeply believe in his ability to take good care of me. I have a really good dentist. I have, these people in my life who are very aligned and really, really helpful. So the policy of, I want it to be a win-win. I want it to feel good. I want there to be good in it for both people. I want it to work out. Or I want to step away and work on freeing up the energy for something new. But the trouble is, if you just step away, but you don't actually free up the energy for something new, and you can't come into relating wholehearted and making generous assumptions, and for sure, moving with discernment, there are lots of times that I decide somebody's just not really reliable. And that's great news when I'm trying to see who would be available to pick me up at the airport or show up for something where I would really be scrambling if they gave me a yes and then bailed on it in the last minute. And I also really understand my part in that. It's a little bit of a digression from the main topic, but in my 20s, I was so good at getting yeses from reluctant people through the relentlessness of my vision. And so to alleviate the pressure of Katie with her vision of something, and it wasn't even necessarily that I was trying to get them to do chores or help me with something, but it could be an activity that I really wanted to participate in. I didn't value the authentic yes or understand how to listen to that. So I got really caught up in a vision, applied too much pressure to make it easy to say no, and then got yeses that weren't authentic that people then found a reason to bail on. One particular romantic relationship ended after I really wanted to go to Death Valley to see the super bloom, and it was, many, many years ago. I've since been to Death Valley on 2 occasions and seen the super bloom, but the fellow I was dating at the time was really a no. Talked him into it, and then he bailed at the last minute, and it just really was a deep disappointment. And at the same time, I could see where my desire and passion for something made it hard to say no. So there is a certain discernment in, really feeling into whether something's a free collaborative yes, or whether they're just saying whatever they need to say to take the pressure off. So there's a lot here. But going back to that kind of experience that we have of being in with someone and having heart connection and having it come to an end in some way, having it maybe run the course. I know one of the sort of hazards if you're on a growth path and you have a lot of friends that's just not interesting. It's kind of like, some people like to play golf. I like introspection and seeing how I can be more elegant and effective in my life. You probably like that too on some level if you're listening to these, long babbling podcasts of mine. And for some people that just isn't their jam. It isn't what's interesting to them. And so there's a risk of outgrowing friendships, of having things that you were willing and able to put up with, and then later wanting more authenticity and emotional health and such. I had a really dear friend, loved her, spent an enormous amount of time with her. And one of the problematic things about the relationship was that most of the time she was building me up, like, 5 out of every, 6 comments was so celebratory and so reflecting me back to myself. And then every once in a while, she'd just take a little pot shot and a little snipe at me. And it wasn't anything that I noticed was like, oh, tension was building and she, was getting annoyed with something in the moment. It just didn't seem to be tied to that, as near as I could tell. Might have been for her. And when I was earlier in the relationship, and less skillful, there was more needs met by the connection that were so valuable that the take out of the emotional bank account every time she did that behavior ended up being worth it. I was still really, in the black with her, it was working out. But over time, as I got healthier and more discerning and more skillful and wasn't, having people clench their teeth from my behavior as often, because I was really emotionally immature and unskillful in relating to people in my 20s. I was the classic academically ahead and socially way behind kind of person. And during that time, I mostly had friends that were a good bit older because they, just kind of had a bigger compassion space for my clumsiness. But as I got healthier and was in therapy, that shifted. I was building more functional relationships, and eventually that was one of a number of factors that had me cooling on the relationship and stepping back. And she didn't do anything wrong. She'd been being that way all the way along, and it was in context to a lot of other things, but eventually it just became combined with some other dynamics that had been fine 5 years earlier, made it not a match that I wanted to lean into or spend time connecting with. And I've also had experiences that were really painful where I wasn't the one to back off. I had many years ago, again, younger Katie, just a woman, we got really, really close. We were talking on the phone, almost every day, and spending time together a couple times a week and sharing just about everything. And I really loved that depth and intimacy and connection. It wasn't in any way romantic, but I was just felt really, really deeply connected to her. And one of the things that I'd noticed was that she tended to suddenly have the story that a relationship was done and cut all ties. And I remember even talking to her, hey, I'm kind of afraid. I've watched you do this, and I'm in really deep with you. Oh, no. But sure enough, because one of the great things is not to imagine we're so different and special that, what someone would do to other people, they would never do to us. And she just woke up one day and was like, Spirit told me we're done. I just know it's for the best. And she wasn't wrong. Honestly, I was heartbroken, and it was a relationship that I was really involved with, but the space that was created opened up for new people to come in, and it ended up being really powerful for me. But in order for new people to come in, if our hearts are all armored up, I remember a client at one point looking at me very intensely, like, I'm choosing to trust you, as though like, don't blow it. And I'm like, I don't want to take that on. That sounds like a lot of pressure. Like, let me just be the authentic version and you make a good choice for yourself. And we could talk about what I'm in for, what I'm willing to commit to in working on your behalf. But there's a challenge where when an empty space is created by a relationship and you've gone through a mourning period and, given your heart time to heal, first of all, being able to mourn something and get to the other side and be neutral about it is a really important piece, and it's a learnable skill. It's not one that most of us are naturally good at or come by, as we go along life. I certainly didn't have that class in high school, and gosh, wouldn't it have been darn useful for them to say, hey, life has grief. You're going to have sadness and disappointment and loss, and you need to know it's not forever, and here are things that you can do to, restore your heart, to cultivate resilience, and a lot of us are holding emotional debt of things that we didn't mourn in the past. And I remember really noticing that. I had a romantic relationship end, and it wasn't such a big deal with him, but there was a lot of grief. And then I noticed, quite a long time after that I was still having grief, and I'm like, oh, this isn't even about that dude. This is about Katie not liking grief. And so not experiencing grief and numbing that emotion and then having emotional debt, because I could have easily been completely over this by now. And sometimes it just varies. Sometimes a really brief relationship takes a long time to reckon with, and other ones that went on for longer, you're like, not a lot of grief there. So I'm not putting a timeline on how much grief there is, but if you're not dealing with contemporary grief only, if you're dealing with old grief and new grief, you can really get mired in it, especially if you try to numb and avoid. So one of the things about becoming available to that, okay, something went away, now there's open space, and having more up-to-date, more contemporary relationship opportunities open and arise on the other side of that, has to do with being able to restore ourselves, to come out the other side. And what I was working with in such a focused way in this journey were two things. One was my trauma healing protocol, where I just go back and I release big emotions from the past, organized energy around these events that were really painful. So if I was doing this for myself, I would go back to this, experience, if I hadn't already, which I had, but if I hadn't, I'd go back to this experience where this woman was like, I think we're just done. Spirit told me we're done. I know it's for the best. Bye. out of this really, really deep relationship, I would go back and dissipate the shock and the pain and the loss and the heartache around that particular way that she just chose to move with people she was connected to that weren't her family of origin. So I could go dissipate that energy. And then, more importantly, the thing that I was really focused on was looking for each of the people in the intensive to say, where have you distorted or changed your energy body's circuitry and receptivity to other humans in an effort to avoid pain? Because one of the pickles that sensitive people with energetic abilities and psychic abilities is we can get ourselves into pickles that, other people couldn't necessarily. And the thing is, we can't necessarily see or know what we're up to. So when we armor up our heart and we lock it down and we put up brambles around, getting to know us, and, there are ways we could look at how we do this with behaviors, but there's also ways that we can literally disrupt the natural flow of our energetic circuitry so that we're not available to connect. It's like, okay, I connected really deeply, got really hurt. Our brain will take that as a like, oh, emotional pain. This must be a survival threat. This is a really old system that tends to interpret uncomfortable emotions as there being a survival threat. So we are having a brain that defaults to trying to avoid the situation. So, okay, avoid connection, avoid being deep with someone, avoid being vulnerable. We have these strategies. And when we're reckoning with this side of things psychologically, it's a really powerful question to ask. What's in the way of really deep, meaningful friendships? What's in the way of, a romantic relationship, if that's something you want? What's in the way of really giving my partner a clean slate about something they did, 15 years ago? And there are different answers to all those questions. And if you want to work one-on-one with me, I'm super happy to help you sort and figure those out. But what's in the way is a really powerful question to ask. And that can start to illuminate where we haven't healed from something, where we've come up with strategies and behaviors that get in the way. But it's also really cool to kind of go into our energy body, even if we don't know how we've done it, and say, I want to put things back right. I want my heart chakra to be available to love. And one of the ways that I trust putting down my armor, it's not that I think other humans are going to not be unskillful with me or not available. I mean, it's sad when I have a huge affinity for somebody and they're such a neat soul and they're just not healthy enough. Like, I just can't communicate. They haven't, dealt with some childhood stuff. And so the filters I'm being perceived through mean that I'll always be in trouble with them in some way, or, there'll be a ton of processing. I really value ease and grace and making generous assumptions. And, if I look at somebody, no matter how much I adore them, if they don't have that capacity to differentiate between, I'm having a really big emotion and obviously you did something wrong because you were in proximity when the really big emotion started, it's going to be hard to have success with that person for any measure of depth. And if you are that person, which honestly I was, and that was part of why therapy was so helpful, it's a good thing to clean up. So it's just neat to do an assessment and see where skill building may be needed. And that's part of my, what would you need to be willing to take off heart armor and really get back in the game of connecting with people? And for me, the answer to that is whenever I analyze something that was really painful or didn't go the way I hoped, I can kind of see like, okay, well, I ignored that warning flag, and for the particular friend I mentioned, the cutting people out of her life on a whim without even a precipitating event, just waking up one day and deciding it. I had all that information, and Katie now probably wouldn't go to that depth with somebody who had that patterning unless I knew they really had their finger on the pulse of why they did it and were actively on some kind of a healing journey to get it cleaned up. And even then I might proceed with caution. Wouldn't mean I wouldn't be friends, but I just might not try to go as deep with someone who had that patterning. So this isn't to condone or justify or let people off the hook for abuse or clumsiness or reprehensible behavior. That's not the point. The point is that in retrospect, you can use those to say, oh, wow, I didn't have the knowledge. I didn't have the discernment. I didn't put the pieces together of what it would mean if somebody had a lot of anger debt. The emotional debt was really a lot of anger. So they would go from apparently zero on the surface to really furious in a short period of time. And if you're in a female body, there's a really good chance that there's instinctual primal fear as a safety threat that you may not be able to override, even if you intellectually know that this man would never ever hurt you. It's just something that's kind of hardwired, and having that activated a lot might make it really expensive to be in relationship. And that can be true for men too, if they're just sensitive to emotional unregulation or have a trauma history. So this isn't anything by any means saying that, we should be able to make it work with all people. I think there's a lot of discernment and sorting for who we go deep with for really authentic alignment. And one of the things I really pay attention to is the both and of the heart chakra and the solar plexus. And I'm going kind of deep on this because I think the first step in healing from relationship betrayal and disappointment is the self-trust of like, oh, I can understand what went wrong, and I understand the possibility of what could be different in the future. So if you're like, yeah, I didn't really know how to heal grief, but that's a learnable skill. I could figure that out. I could learn my own secret recipe, or not so secret, and there are a lot of humans who have a lot of wisdom, who have, written books and made YouTube videos and talked in podcasts. Like there's a lot of, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot out there. A good therapist can help you. You can learn the skill of recovering from grief. And if you're like, yeah, I really have self-trust that I could recover from grief, it isn't such a risk. It may feel like a risk, but you can be like, yeah, I might get disappointed. And, I recently stepped away from online dating for a while because I had another crazy complicated situation in my life. And I was like, I just don't have the emotional resilience to deal with highs and lows of dating, because it is really unpredictable. And yeah, if I get disappointed, it's going to land a lot heavier because of what I already have in my emotional stack. Won't be forever, but take a hiatus, have the situation resolved, then I can get back in the game. And so that's legit too. But this idea that you can see like, oh, okay, if I didn't have the skills in my late 20s and early 30s to deal very well with big grief, but me in my late 40s, I have a lot more skills. I have a lot more ability to trust myself that it's not my favorite flavor, and I'm not going to go out of my way to, be in a situation that has very low chance of success. But, if it happens, I can afford to be in the game because I trust myself to recover. And the more that I understand people, the more that I can have discernment of like, oh, this person is sitting on a lot of emotional debt and it's translating into reactivity. And then they're wanting to process as though their pain was coming from something contemporary in our relationship. And they're wanting me to accommodate a lot of reactivity and buttons. I might be like, that's going to get exhausting over time. And so I'm not in for that. Or if someone's story of who they are and what they're telling me about themselves is really different from who I experience them to be, I know I'm not going to have success with that. I really need congruence, success in communication. I have a lot of skill. I've cultivated a lot of communication skill. And if I still just cannot make it work with the other person, no matter how delightful they may be in other ways, it's just never going to work out. There's no point in investing. So as we get older, we start to have more discernment so we can move with skill. So the combination of I trust my discernment, I know a lot, I learn more all the time, and if I do get some new experience or just caught up in the shininess of something, I can restore myself. And that could be a place where you could be like, yeah, I don't have to try to keep myself safe with heart armor or not being available to love or expecting somebody to run the gauntlet of proving themselves 27 times over before I will, participate with them at all. Like, that kind of healthy people probably aren't going to try to do a gauntlet like that if they can't just be assumed that they're coming from a good place. If they're coming from a good place, that just may not be what healthy people do. So the people who do try to run those gauntlets and prove themselves are probably coming from a more addictive place. And if you're someone's drug of choice, that's not going to create the most relationship health and sustainability if they're just so determined that there isn't like, oh wow, you're awesome, let's see what we can co-create. Because there are a lot of relationships that are driven by addiction and non-stated desires, a lot of complexity in that. So going back to one of the points that I think is really important, there's the heart chakra and solar plexus, and those can get into an adversarial relationship. A lot of people feel like they can either hold boundaries and be clear about what is and is not okay with them, or they can have love. And so what often happens is, in desire to maintain comfort and not have friction or not have anything come up, when low level, like, hey, this doesn't work so well for me, start to come up, the heart's going, shut up, shut up, shut up. I just want to stay in connection. Don't ruin this for me. Because the heart can get really, really lonely and really have this longing and just really want to override the wisdom of all the other chakras because the heart connection feels so good. And then the anger and the resentment and what's not okay builds. And then at some point, the power flips and the solar plexus unilaterally takes over. And that's where, the petty offense file and everything that someone's mad about gets blurted out and all the things they've been holding on to. And it's a hot mess. A lot of relationships end in that moment. And there's just a lot of kind of damage because then the heart is out of it. So it's not coming to the other person saying, I love you, and there's this thing that's not working for me, and I really want to get back on track because I value our connection. And I don't think you mean to have this impact, but I just want to see if we can work it through. There's a guy named Reid Mihalko who's like written out the difficult conversational formula. A woman named Alison Armstrong has her coughing up the truth, which I think really, really speaks into that. And she's like, cough it up, blow it up, clean it up, and that's her process. But if you, as an active human spirit, speak up about something that is causing you to lose love and respect and affinity. And even if it's not causing you to lose love, if it's losing affinity, if it's losing desire to be with them, it's pretty important to address. And it's better to address proactively as an act of courage, even when you're, not ready to leave, than how it comes up when you end up just blurting out the truth because you've been pushing it down so hard and suddenly you can't stand it anymore. And there's a lot more opportunity for success if you're in relationship and connection with all the chakras, because I have certainly had the experience of being really sexually attracted to someone and really liking their soul and trying to override the throat chakra, which is saying, hey, I'm not being met in communication. This is going to be a problem. And it's never ever gone well. And, sometimes you're just having an experience that's emotionally expensive because you're really compelled in some way. And that's okay too. But having done some of those, I don't necessarily feel like there's some experience that's worth a lot of emotional cleanup on the other side. So I trust myself to be able to restore and clean up and recover. But I also know that takes energy. And so I'm thoughtful about trying to stack the odds in my favor for success before I commit a lot of energy. And just knowing that I can have soul affinity, I can have heart affinity, I can have profound appreciation, I can feel love. And that's not the same as like being able to successfully relate. That's a journey and an experience that unfolds. And so I think these are really good questions to sit with if you're longing for connection, whether it's friendship or romantic relationship or people with mutually beneficial, ways that you can support each other and team together really well to get something done. And if you don't feel any of that, if you're very isolated and you're like, I don't really miss it, I invite you to really see if that's true for all parts of you, because the dominant part of you may have decided that it works better to be isolated than to take emotional risks, but there may be something below the surface. And whenever one part of us unilaterally overrides another part of us and that part isn't being listened to, you often get those parts that are sort of disenfranchised and being ignored and not having their needs met, sort of going covert. So that could be the person who isolates and then suddenly is moving across the country to be with someone they've only talked to on the internet, because there's so much loneliness that the pendulum swings the other way. Another good example is the person who hates their job, hates their job, hates their job, won't quit, won't quit, won't quit. Finally, something happens, a health crisis, a blowing up at the boss, they get laid off, something happens to move them out of that, and then they can't seem to wrangle themselves to look for another job when they need to. And that was this power struggle where one part of them was saying, hey, this doesn't work. If you're working really long hours and then you get the downtime, resting is appropriate, but then they may stay stuck in a rest and procrastination cycle because they don't trust that their other part that had them really over functioning. And you can have these really significant power struggles. And similarly, it's just good to look at where power struggles happen between the chakras. And for example, if you're like, no sex, no sex, no sex, the longing for sex can build up and be so big that you lie to yourself and ignore your discernment and do something that, isn't necessarily the most holistic approach. And so it's very useful to notice that tension. And even if you're like, no, I'm really isolated, but I like it that way, it's cool, you may want to check in and see if there's a part of yourself that feels differently about that, and what compromise could be made between the part of you that doesn't feel a need, likes the safety of not connecting, and the part of you that longs for connection. And it may be something where you find very moderate ways to meet those needs. I love connection, and I need a lot of alone time, and I'm in communion with spirit a lot. And being alone in my house with my cat is something that I really deeply, authentically enjoy about life. And I feel very rich in the connections that I have. So it doesn't mean you have to suddenly be super extroverted, spend all your time with other people. We're not talking about this. It's more looking really deeply and saying, is there a time that I got so hurt that I haven't cleaned up or made right with myself, that I took myself out of the game in some way? And you can ask that question from an emotional perspective, from a psychological perspective, and more important, from an energy body perspective. Have I armored up my heart? Have I broken or disrupted pathways and circuitry that is about my innate energetic capacity to connect successfully with other humans? Because if you've damaged that, then when you have that loss, there isn't space for something else to come in. And that's a really hard place to be. And when people feel like they don't have capacity to connect with people, they often, out of the loneliness, try to make unsustainable compromises. And, our brains will lie to us because they were designed as hunter-gatherer people mostly, and then some farming. And you probably did know all the adults that were in your tribe or in your community. There just was this like, yeah, I've met all the people that are players in my life in these small groups of humans that we used to participate with. And once in a blue moon, you might have a more diverse experience, but mostly it was, like these are the people I'm incarnate with in this lifetime and working with. But that's not what we have in the modern era. So your brain will lie to you about there being scarcity, and that sometimes makes us try to sustain relationship across deal breakers. And one of my kind of useful distinctions is that I differentiate the kind of deep, profound love we have for another human and the affinity and enjoyment that comes from having an emotional bank account that's in the positive. So you can love someone profoundly, but their behavior when they're under the influence of alcohol has diminished their affinity. And the fact that they have gambling debts, and have created financial chaos means that no matter how sweet and kind or how many times they bring you breakfast in bed and are so, so, so sorry, you don't feel good about them. It doesn't make up for it. And I find that's really useful because one of the things, especially as a woman, and I don't want to generalize about men, and this won't apply to some women, but as a woman, our feelings are our connection to the eternal. And it's very difficult for a woman to move in a direction that doesn't feel right. And if we end up in a situation where we're in a relationship that is not keeping the emotional bank account in the positive, it's overdrawn, there's more aggravation than what's filling us up, then nothing is going to feel right because we still love the person. We might have terror about leaving. There might be other like, oh, but this is economically advantageous. The root chakra is like, no, I like the stability. The instincts are like, don't change. There are tigers out there. You're safe here. I don't care if you're unhappy. That's not my business. But nothing feels right going or staying. And that's a very, very disorienting kind of way to feel. But when we get clear of it, it can make us not be available to get back in the game with our growing and our discernment and our clarity. So I just want to offer some of these things. Sometimes we just need to move in a way where nothing feels right if we're in an unhealthy relationship that doesn't serve, in order to come into clarity. So there's so much here. It's so much easier to teach people to do a journey and talk to their guides than it is to relate successfully with all the lack of health and craziness and complexity that other humans throw at us. But I think it's so rewarding. It's so much about what we get to experience on the planet. And so I hope that there's something in here where you can sort of troubleshoot what might be in the way of you being available to discerningly opening your heart freely to move forward in connection. And there's self-trust, there's discernment, and there's also cleaning up the past. And so treating old wounds as something that it's a learnable skill, and there are processes that work very effectively for doing that. There's a lot of facilitation and opportunity to be free of that so that you can really be walking around with a normal functioning energy body that's available for connection, and make really contemporary choices for yourself based on all of the adult wisdom and knowledge and experiences and what you've lived through and what fills you up and has the most rewards about connecting and all of those kind of things. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.